Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road towards the Anselm Society digital pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and, well, the wackiest names of our pets. In the corner by the fire are three people. One of them is arguing that hers was the best, Nimrod, the mighty hunter. He was an orange tabby cat. And yes, that's me, your co-host, Christina Brown. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories so that we can better understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. Do you ever struggle to name something or someone? A pet, a new company, a book title, or even your own child? Ha, I did. That is because there is power in a name, more than we can possibly know or understand on this side of the veil. And yet we do understand that there is significance linked to this struggle. A name bears weight, and the art of naming is something that can make all the difference between hope or despair, the communion of souls or their dispersion. But don't worry, we have an expert on the podcast today to talk us through the perilous and the beautiful waters of naming and being named. Marilyn McIntyre, teacher, writer, and author of multiple thought-provoking books, more on that later, has joined us to discuss her contribution to Anselm Society's inaugural book, Why We Create. If you want to know what that book is, or why Anselm cares, please check out the podcast we did with Anselm Society Director Brian Brown. And yes, it dropped September 29th. Meanwhile, we will assume that your attention is absolutely and totally piqued and that we're going to dive into a conversation on Marilyn's chapter entitled The Art of Naming. But of course, before we do that, I want to welcome co-host extraordinaire Matthew Mellema to the podcast. Hello, Matthew.
You named your cat Nimrod? Also, hello.
Also, hello. Isn't that great?
Wow. It is weird with Nimrod, right? Because in the book of Genesis, he's portrayed as like this mighty hunter, but it's come down to mean like an idiot. I have no idea how that happened.
I don't either. I don't understand. Maybe our guest does, speaking of names. Marilyn, we're utterly delighted to have you. Thank you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Do you happen to know anything about the origins of the name Nimrod and how it came to mean idiot?
I don't know, although I do know that a lot of words degenerate over time. And so, who knows?
That's true. Full disclosure, it was my father's idea at the time, so I can blame him for that. Although I do like to talk about how I had a cat named Nimrod, so he gets the credit and the blame for whatever that's worth. All right. So can we just begin, Marilyn, by just kind of asking like a generally broad question? Why is naming such a powerful action?
Well, I think probably to take it back to the ancient sources, it's good to remember that naming comes up 800 to 1,000 times in the Bible. And when Adam is given the power to name the creatures of the earth, that is understood by most people as a consignment of extraordinary power to this one human creature to come into relationship, not just to govern or control, but to come into relationship with all of those things. So I think naming puts you in a relationship. As soon as a parent names a new baby, something about the relationship comes into being at that point. Mm-hmm. And pretty much every traditional culture has naming ceremonies to recognize the importance of names, and then renaming ceremonies around bar mitzvahs or confirmation or coming of age moments. And the name, of course, traditionally in this culture, women have changed their names, although now they don't, so many of them, at the time of marriage. But a name is always a signifier of a relationship, a role, a status, a place on earth, and a place in the sacred order. That's one thing. And I think the other thing to say about the power of names is that it can be used for good or ill. In my essay, I talked about the fact that a mark of colonialism is the naming or renaming of all kinds of places that had indigenous names. And so, as we see in many places in this country, we're in the process of retrieving those names. And it's in many places and for many people an awkward process, but really trying to recognize the fact that when colonizers came and renamed places, they were expropriating, stealing something from people that was sacred. So it's a lot to say about the power of naming.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so important or has been so important for people to quote unquote conquer a place and name it under their like name it to claim it? Like why is that so important to society? And over the last like thousands of years is what I'm getting at. Like why do you think that possessiveness of name calling in a sense has always been a necessary, in their view, part of ruling?
Well, because naming brings it into your own language, it brings it into your own culture. All of the saints' names that the Catholic missionaries brought over. I mean, I live in California. There, every other town is San something or other or Santa something or other. So it's not as though there's something inherently wrong with honoring a saint by naming a place, except that, again, those names displaced the tribal names that belong to the land. And so I remember years ago hearing a fascinating lecture by a young economist who started the lecture with the question, how does a thing become property? And, people would say you buy it or you steal it or whatever, but it goes back and back and back and back. How did it become mine? And I suppose we could raise the question, how did it become theirs? But it's certainly clear that all of those new names in the United States, what is now the United States, New York, New Mexico, New Haven, they aren't new, but they were imported from the places people came from. And so it's a way of connecting them to their original place, but also a way of saying, this is ours now. So
Right.
it's very problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because the power of words, just in general, is one of your specialties. And I know you have done a lot of studying and writing on them. You have a lot of wisdom and expertise just when it comes to just the deep symbolism of language in general. I've even heard you, if I recall correctly, on a podcast a while back, kind of referring to words as possessing a kind of power or energy. So like once it's issued either vocally or in writing, it kind of initiates a reaction that can't be undone, kind of like a breath, if you will, like once it's breathed out, can't be reversed actually, like from carbon dioxide back into oxygen just by like calling it back. It's kind of like a carbon imprint now, and the atmosphere will like absorb it and make use of it, but not without like an impact. And it's kind of like that old like saying like sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Like that is like so not true. Now, I definitely hold to the fact that people made up that rhyme because words hurt so bad. And so I honestly think that rhyme kind of came into being because people are trying to tell themselves it's just words. Words shouldn't hurt me. But in fact, they really, really do. So what would you say about just the whole idea of words having power?
Well, again, to take it back to the very beginning, in the beginning was the Word, and in this faith tradition, we believe that, and that God brought everything forth by utterance. And the medieval idea of the music of the spheres is to say that everything in creation is a vibration. A word sets a vibration in motion.
Yeah.
So the word dabar in Hebrew, as I understand it, is also the word for thing. So when we speak, we bring something into the world. As you said, you can't exactly retrieve it. And we make things happen. There's the kind of speech like the speech of blessing actually confers a blessing. And we still have a whole category of speech that brings about sacramentally what it names. But I also think, as you say, that when you speak, it does bring about something. It brings about a shift in the conversation, in the moment, in the relationship, in the mood. So it's also the case that every time we speak, we are participating in the history of that word. All words have resonances, and every word is
Yes,
a
I love that.
trigger. I might say a word like lilac, and you would think of your grandmother's wallpaper, and I would think of a Whitman poem, and somebody else might think of how they're fading in the garden. But every word carries its own personal and cultural resonance. And so the mix of words is so complex. Things, they never just mean what they mean at one level. And that's the beauty of them. That's the beauty of poetry. I mean, the point of poetry is to elevate ambiguity rather than suppress it, and to say, look at this whole field of meaning, and to understand how words are like chemicals. When you set them next to each other, something happens, even before they grow up to become a sentence.
Yeah. I really love that. Just the whole idea. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she was talking about just something hard and something very traumatic that was happening to someone in her family, and it just happened. So she was telling me and she was like trying to put words to it. And she's like, I know I just can't. If I could write poetry, I feel like I could do this so much more justice. And the whole concept, like the whole idea of like her saying that resonated with me as someone who loves poetry and has dabbled in it. It is because it's like, I get that. There is something about the power of words to bring kind of something into being that you know is there. And the words give it that power, that give us that validity. And that's, I think, why a lot of people love poems in that way, because there's a naming going on. There's a pulling at something very real that we can't always touch or articulate. So anyway, just to support what you said. So when we talked about the power of naming, right, and obviously be used for good or ill. And on page, I believe it was 109 of your chapter, I quote you saying something that was just very, very succinct. And I'd love you to kind of go into this and kind of what you are, just some more examples. You talked a little bit about the subduing of other nations, but just a little bit more example about why an act of naming as power can be really detrimental. You say here on page 109, you say, words are instruments that control, confine, consign, or perhaps enliven and empower. They kill or heal. When we speak them into the universe, there is an answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that comes back to the idea that the power of speech itself is related to what we understand to be prayer. That speech, the gift of speech, brings us into relationship to the one who was and is the Word. And so that idea that when we speak words into the universe, there's an answer, there's an effect. And there is nothing, there's a book called The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, in which the very opening sentence is, there is no such thing as neutral space.
Oh, that's cool.
And in the same spirit, I think there is no such thing as a neutral word. All words have these layers and layers of resonance and meaning and history and association. We exchange them as a currency, and we're always translating for each other. Because what I mean, think about how often we ask each other the question, what do you mean? Which is really a very complicated question. What you're asking me, if you say, what do you mean, is, would you translate that into different terms? And as soon as you put it in different terms, it changes a little bit. And so that play of words is part of their richness and versatility and agility. And it's fun to say, okay, here's what I mean, and reword it. One of the exercises I've given students in writing classes from time to time is just write a sentence delivering some information. Now write it again in different words. Now give me the
Nice.
same information in different words. And to write it 3 or 4 times, telling it in a different way. And then look at it and see what happened. Or imagine that you have had the experience of looking at different translations of scripture, same passage. But it's fascinating to look at what difference the differences make.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're always translating. It's not just from one language to another. It's from one version of our own language to another.
Yeah. What would you say about, and you use this example a little bit in the book too, but what would you say about the Tower of Babel as we understand the biblical story? About the idea of the unity of language and then dispersion / dispersal / confusion, the changing of tongues and tribes and separation. And why is that such an important story to understand if we're looking at why naming and words play such an important role in humanity?
Boy, that's a big one. And
I know.
a lot has been written about the Tower of Babel. And I think there are different ways to read that story, as there are all biblical stories. But my understanding of it is two-sided. One is obviously that it's a story about fragmentation. It's a story about the splintering of the human community. And the fact that warfare comes from the insularity, that comes from the tribalism in which people tell their own stories in their own language on their own terms. And so we've always had people who, theologians and poets and philosophers who hold what one poet called the dream of a common language. And I think part of the human longing to return home, in a sense, the longing for heaven, has partly to do with that time when we will all be one community. The American romantics, like Emerson, Thoreau, the rest of them, they were very taken with the idea of an original language. And that
Cool.
if you dive deeply enough into the etymologies of words and into the histories of words, that you can find the taproots of language. And that's the place at which we resonate together with the original words. I don't know, that's not really a historical idea so much as an ideal.
Right, but I still love that. I didn't know that. I get that yearning, that craving. That's interesting. I had no idea.
On the other hand, if you look at lots of different languages, there's a richness to all of that you could think of it not simply just as a fragmentation or splintering, but as a kind of flowering of possibility. And I know a linguist who is working very hard to conserve a language that's about to disappear. A lot of tribal languages have only a handful of speakers left. And she said she's often asked, why would you do that? But she said it's like biodiversity. As soon as a language disappears from the face of the earth, there are things we will never really see again. We'll never put that frame around it. So there's something in human understanding that's preserved in each language. I'm sorry, Matthew, you were...
Into that point, you mentioned earlier with the Tower of Babel analogy and how it can be interpreted different ways, as every story can be. Would you say then that the fragmentation into different languages is a curse, where but for humanity's fallenness, we would all have one language and everything would be in one harmony? Or do you view that the different languages are a sort of blessing?
I think that traditionally that has been most widely read as a curse, that humankind a kind of punishment. But I don't think that's the only reading of it. And I love an old Hasidic story that I won't be able to tell verbatim, but there's a rabbi who, when a young man comes to him rejoicing over something, he says, "How do you know it's not a disaster?" And later, when the young man comes to him lamenting a loss, he says, "How do you know it's not a blessing?" And I love the two-sidedness of that understanding, that curse and blessing are often entwined in some way. I think about Jacob limping away from Peniel. He's been touched by an angel. His hip has been broken. He's lame now. Is that a curse or a blessing? Well, it's certainly a mark of a divine encounter. And so I think that it's important not to be too quick to decide which it is, but to keep that question open. How do we know that there isn't a blessing embedded in the curse? In the sense that part of our faith understanding is that God has historically and can bring good out of evil. So what we call evil, well, an Aramaic scholar I very much respect talks about the fact that the words that are often translated good and evil can be translated as ripe or unripe. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And so if it's unripe, it's not ready. It's not mature enough. It can't hold what is being, the weight of what's being conferred. So I don't mean to just dodge the question, but I think that those words, good and evil, or blessing and curse, are ones that we have to kind of hold with an open hand and ask ourselves when we use them, what do we mean by that? And how do we know it's not a blessing? How do we know what will come of this? We don't, because God makes things happen over time and in mysterious ways, and nothing is just what it is in any given moment. But that's what's so wonderful about the nature of story, that you can keep rereading it. And you can say, this is a story about scattering. This is a story about proliferating. This is a story about enriching humankind. This is a story about alienating humans, and so on. That's a good exercise, too. Just finish the sentence, this is a story about, and see how many ways you can do that.
Yeah.
To your point about, the words we use, especially for like goodness, I heard someone talk about this in relation to the Garden of Eden in Genesis, where when we say it was good, we don't mean it was like perfectly perfect and there was no way to improve upon it. We mean it was good, but it was incomplete. It was sort of like a blank canvas that still needed work and tilling and all of that to help it come to fruition. So with that in mind, I kind of want to look at the flip side of something you were discussing earlier. Because, you talked about how in the nature of like colonialism, using a word as sort of this imperial display of power. But there's also the flip side of that, which I think would be Adam naming the different animals. So what would be the difference there between naming something sort of in the good sense and versus naming something in the more imperial sense?
Well, I think that raises the whole question of what is mine. When God says, I have called you by name and you are mine, that's really a very clear statement of the way a name is the signifier that you belong to me, you belong with me. But when we do that, it has to be qualified by the question of what is mine. And especially in terms of human relationships of both individuals and communities. Insofar as naming indicates possession or taking possession, we've got to be awfully careful with that. I mean, even parents naming babies, they're consigning that child to live with that name for a long time. And some people hate their names and they change them later and so on. But we all have names, and we know that there's a way in which the name we carry acquires meaning within our friend groups. And some people, I've never liked my first name. It's kind of a period name, but oh well, that's what I thought. And I know people who have changed their names. And at one point when I moved, I actually thought, I'm going to do a bit different version of my name that I like better. But it really didn't work. That's hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
So you grow around your name and you grow with your name. And the more people who know you, the more it becomes the little kind of chain that connects you to those you care about. But Matthew, to go back to the question of when can that be a good thing to kind of impose a new name on something? I think to come into a new place and make a name for it as a sign of thanksgiving, for instance. Or to use the example I used before, when the Catholic missionaries came and they named so many places after saints, they were really trying to bring these places into their understanding of the broad communion of saints, that this is a place in the community of God and Christ on earth. So I think there could have been a lot of goodwill in that. And it's also true that there are layers of human community in the history of any place. So I think I don't mean simply to vilify the work or intentions of settlers, but I think an awful lot flies under the term settlement when it's actually expropriation. So in the whole business of revisiting history, I think we have to ask ourselves, what were the intentions when people came in, claimed, renamed, imposed their own rule of law and their own structures of power? All of that goes together. And there can be benevolence and also great harm coexisting in that process.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it is. It's the with great power comes great responsibility, and that's just the way it is and always has been. Thank you, Spider-Man, for pulling that into, into the consciousness of the general populace, right? Or Marvel, I should say. Thank you, Marvel. But speaking of that, I want to kind of go into the call of Christians to steward creation. And how that can play into the concept of naming. And even though steward is a loaded word, for our purposes, I want to refer to it as the call to be protective of the God-given integrity of creation's inherent identity/identities. So, given that it is powerful and dangerous and beautiful all at once, how can Christians counteract that potential evil while also taking it sort of a stewardship, an active action? Doesn't make any sense. Action is active. Sorry. Taking a role in embodying sort of God's love and his request, even as Adam, to name something, to call something out into goodness and truth and into identity. I just keep thinking about, I know you also talked in your chapter about the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. Is that how you pronounce her last name?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I would love to, when you're talking about her and her work, that was very interesting to me too. And correct me if I'm wrong, but she seems to really have a very good both and perspective on this, in that she wanted to respect the name and what it was and the science of the thing, the classification, but also the core of what it is. You also mentioned T.S. Eliot's poem about cats. This was all great. And so there's this concept of how as Christians do we this is so complicated, but how do we speak into what something is by its name? It's a tricky path, but anyway, how can Christians kind of do that in the 21st century?
I think one of the things that we can do is to acknowledge along the way that the words we bring to something only apply to it in part, that anything we call something is one way of seeing it. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about her efforts to bring together the language of empirical science and botany and the Linnaean classification system with all the Latin names, the two-part Latin names. That's a very valuable way of classifying the world of plants. Same thing in zoology with the world of animals. And so
it helps us kind of sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we have these systems of naming that have been enormously useful. On the other hand, she wants to weave that together, braid it together, as it were, with in her case, the Potawatomi language, but a tribal language in which the names of things are connected to the myths and the stories that help people to understand them, to understand their function, their sacredness, their relationship to each other in the ecosystem. And really, there's a lot of deep science in tribal mythologies, in the tribal wisdom about how to live on the land.
Yeah.
So I think that we are at a moment in history where we have enough access to enough varieties of human understanding to make it our business to take that layered approach to whatever it is that we try to understand. I mean, I
Yeah.
think about the naming of nations.
Hmm.
Nationalism is a real problem at this point, and I often wonder what if we referred to one another as Earthlings rather than Americans or Brazilians. No, it makes a difference. And
I
it's
know
not going
it
to happen
does.
anytime soon, but I like the term Earthlings because
You're
it's a reminder
speaking
that we
you're speaking
all
Matt Malama's
inhabit.
language because he loves aliens and all things outer space and UFO and yeah.
Well, I don't think you have to love all things alien and outer space to love the term Earthling because it does say we're on this planet together. There's a lovely line in one of the prayers from in the Book of Common Prayer that speaks about this fragile Earth, our island home.
Oh yes.
And I love that this is our island home. And to speak of the Earth as home is different from speaking of the Earth as planet. So just bringing those two words next to each other, Earth and home, puts a different frame around the notion of what is the Earth that we live on and whose is it and how do we inhabit it responsibly.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think the responsibly is big. And I loved the way you used the word layered. We have, I think, as a 21st century, and even the 20th, there really aren't places, generally speaking, that are not explored, right? We pretty much, we have satellites, we have all kinds of tech, we've traveled the globe as far as we know. There are a lot of things we know. Everything that we know really has a name or had one at some point. There's a lot of classification that has gone on at this point in the life of humanity. So because we have that and we don't necessarily have a lot of borders to quote unquote expand, there does seem to me to be a responsibility that's different than, not wholly different, but perhaps different than, say, what this is a charged example, but what Christopher Columbus had when he went to the Americas, right? Which were, like when he named them and claimed them. And so I think there is a difference now, and there's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. And I know a way not to do it is to become like overly. No, I don't know how to say what I was about to say there. So I guess that's my cue to ask you. What would be, say, let's just use me as an example, a regular housewife, mother of two children, lives middle-class life in Colorado in the year 2023. What would be a good way for me to go about my day with a perspective of protecting the God-given nature and identity and names of the creation around me? Is that too complicated of a question?
No, I
Okay.
think it comes back to attentiveness to language as one of the resources that we live with. And I think that one of the ways to help keep each other conscious about the words we choose and the weight of those words and the many-sidedness of those words is to pause over words often and to say, when I use a
Mhm.
word like that, this is why I think it's a little bit problematic, or this is why this is a really precious word to me. I love that word. Or I wonder why you might put it in exactly that way. Or could you reword that for me? Because I find that word choice puzzling. So just to make words part of the conversation themselves is to
Hmm.
recognize that when we utter them, we are affecting each other and the things that we speak about. I also think it's fun to be playful about making little shifts. Like I think in the piece that I wrote, I raised the question of what would happen if we spoke about plants or animals as who rather than what? As
Yeah.
soon as you call a cow instead of livestock, that puts you in a slightly different relationship to it. And if you call her she rather than it, that also suggests a level of relationship with another living being, not just a commodity.
Right.
So, I mean, if we look at a forest and see lumber, that's one thing. If we look at a forest and see the lungs of the earth, that's another thing.
That is so cool. That whole phrase right there. If you
The
haven't
lungs of
written
the
anything
earth.
on that exact line, you need to now.
Well, I think it's really important to think of rainforests as the lungs of the earth, and also to see how, as soon as you bring in lungs, we're also very much aware after COVID of the susceptibility of human beings who have respiratory systems that depend on the cleanliness of the air. And so metaphor is a whole dimension of language we haven't mentioned.
Yeah, not at all.
It's
Which
such
I
a
was just
human
thinking
thing
of,
to do.
yeah, of God breathing life into Adam's lungs, and Christ as the Word made flesh, and the Word dwelt among us. And like there are so many metaphors in Scripture, and life in general. I mean, we've taken our cue from Scripture, of course, because if Christ is the Word, God is the Word, and all proceeds from Him. Yeah, there are so many metaphors that really connect us cross culturally, cross language, and cross years, cross time and space.
So to that point, because we can all think of obvious metaphors, right? You know, I'm as hungry as a bear, whatever. But there's some linguists who would argue that, in a sense, that all language is metaphor. So it's sort of drawing an analogy to the outside world and sort of wrapping it in this word coat, which is a metaphor. There. So what's your take on
We can't
that?
escape
Do
it,
you think,
Matthew.
in a sense, that all language is metaphorical, just intrinsically?
Well, I think you can't avoid it. That we speak in metaphors that are so embedded we forget they are metaphors. Every time you use an expression
Yes.
like, well, this is an obvious one, but like that was a slam dunk, or I just couldn't swallow that, or he's a pain in the neck. All of these kind of little metaphors that give us a body sense of what we're talking about, those are unavoidable. But I spent some time working in medical school environments, and one of the things we talked about a number of times was the pervasiveness of military metaphors in medicine, for instance.
Oh,
So to
interesting.
talk about fighting cancer or any other disease, to bombard things with antibiotics, or to take an aggressive approach. That I heard an interesting I read an interesting story about that in a book a friend of mine wrote about a young man who was a Quaker, lifelong pacifist, and he developed cancer, and his oncologist kept using this language of fighting. We're going to fight this. You're a fighter. We're going to defeat this. And finally he said, I'm not a fighter. My whole life, I've tried to avoid being a fighter. This language doesn't work for me. I don't want to think of my body as a battleground. It doesn't help me heal. Can
So
we find
interesting.
another way to talk about this? And to his credit, the oncologist sat with him and said, why don't we talk about it as a journey? And it made a huge difference
Huh.
to talk about the stages on the journey and the turning points on the journey and the detours. So that's just one simple example. There's marketing language that gets imported into the church, for instance. It's very troubling to me. I remember making the observation to a group one time that evangelism isn't the same as marketing, and somebody said, "It isn't?" So there's a conversation to have.
Yep.
No, but marketing language in higher education, where I spent a lot of my life, was very troubling to me because education is not a product you sell, even though people are paying tuition. And so the confusion of categories really makes a difference in the way we value and conduct ourselves within those structures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to take some examples there, when you started your answer there, you said you can't avoid it.
Mhm.
That's a metaphor, thinking that it's a concept, it's like a thing that you need to step aside or else it'll hit you.
Right.
Then you said it's embedded in our language. Embedded is a metaphor, as if it's a seed planted in the ground. You really cannot escape it, another metaphor.
Right.
But to your point, it is very interesting how these metaphors, which again, that's basically what language is, can frame things in very subtle ways. Like, I will be honest, when you were describing the Quaker man trying not to use battle language against cancer, I was thinking, okay, that makes sense, but like, how else are you going to describe it? You know, just because that's so pervasive in my mind and probably a lot of other people's minds that it is sort of dominated the entire playing field. Sports metaphor. So what are some other ways that we can be more cognizant of these metaphors? Do you think that there's something we should actively fight against if they're framed in a different way, or do you think they're just embedded?
Well, they are embedded, but I think that one of the things we can do is be conscious about them. I mean, there are so many things that we use, and if we use them more consciously and intentionally and skillfully, we use them better, right? Tools. And so it seems to me that if we just attune ourselves to the fact that we are using metaphors, and again, pause over them now and then and say, you know, I recognize that we're using a lot of sports metaphors to describe war. And that's really not okay with me because war is so destructive. And the kind of warfare we conduct now is so morally problematic and expensive, and it's completely embedded with the weapons industry. And so to use a sports metaphor and to reduce what's happening in a sense to teams that you line up behind trivializes warfare in a way that I think is very dangerous. It's morally dangerous. There's a category in psychology called moral injury. And we do moral injury when we trivialize something that's really harmful. And if we're going to engage in war, then we need to be able to be very clear about what we're doing and not diminish it by metaphors that make it somehow more benevolent than it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and you say here, and I was just looking for your book as you were talking, and came across the part here where you said paying attention to words and their effects upon the material and spiritual orders we inhabit is surely part of our calling as people of faith. So we've kind of come away a little bit from, we've talked a lot about the beautiful and scary and wonderful complexity of language and naming. But I kind of want to pull it back a little bit into the Christian understanding. How do we, as followers of God, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. How do we, as Christians who really truly believe that Word is enfleshment, how do we take this context and name things responsibly and lovingly and call others to co-create / subcreate with our Lord in that process?
Well, I think part of it has to do with reclaiming. I mean, I think about how many agricultural metaphors Jesus used.
Yes.
And I think about, well, in my book, Caring for Words, I use the analogy throughout of caring for the soil. Soil can go dead.
Yes.
If you want things to grow and be fruitful in the soil, then you have to care for the soil itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be replenished. And there have to be the microorganisms in it that keep giving it life. And so in the same way, I think that we need to look at public discourse, for instance, and to recognize when certain words have become so impregnated with partisan meanings, for instance, or with hateful meanings, then maybe we need to retire them for a while. Or if not retire them, maybe we need to talk about them every time we use them. I mean,
Yeah.
even the word Christian has become so contentiously appropriated by different groups that I feel the need in some environments to pause over it and to say, and my understanding of Christian is this. My understanding of what it means to follow Christ is this. It's not a party label. So I think that we live in an environment where we just have to keep gently retrieving language from a whole variety of kinds of abuses, or simply if it's been used up in commercial environments too much, so that it's incessantly associated with a product or a process, then we need to reclaim it somehow or say, I don't want to use it like that.
Yeah.
I think that intentionality is part of our responsibility as people of the word.
I like that a lot. I think that's important. And I love, of course, the word reclaim. That's always really affected me as a Christian, because I think obviously it can have poor connotations. If you think about like it in like battle, like reclaim our land, like you don't want to do that. But kind of going back to like reclaiming the integrity of the identity of the thing, or the group or the place, or the people. And I think what's made me sad, just personally as a Christian, and watching a lot of fellow Christians, who want to sort of reclaim some of the goodness of a thing, do it in a reactionary way, and so it in and of itself creates this sort of polarizing effect. And so all of a sudden now there's just this sort of word battle happening back and forth and labels flying. Instead of that, there was another word you used in there, and of course I couldn't remember what. Retrieving, I think. Yeah, that's what it was. So it's more reactionary and less kind of like going back and retrieving the original meaning and usage and origin of the concept or the person or the place or the again, like what it means to be a Christian. Do you
or
have?
if not retrieving the original, at least retrieving its usefulness by making it new, which is part of how poets have understood their work. We really need poets. And I think there are lots of cultures that acknowledge that. Poets have a very important place in the culture. In American culture, we tend to consign it to coffee shops and people who read each other's poetry. But
Yes.
But that's problematic. I mean, there's a reason we still have a poet showing up at inaugurations. It's because there's a vestigial understanding that poets serve an important function in public life, because they are the ones who enable us to hear words in a new way, in a new context, and to set them next to one another, so that once you've heard, I don't know, let me just pull a line from a poem by Hopkins. It says, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes, lovely in limbs not his. I mean, that line, you could spend a lot of time with that line. But sometimes I look at a group of children playing and I think lovely in eyes, lovely in limbs not his. And that Christ is among us and the Spirit moves among us and within us. It offers me a way of seeing people that I wouldn't have if I didn't have that line of poetry.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. I think that we can make churches places where the poetry of the Psalms is honored as poetry, and where poetry is brought into the common discourse of the community.
Yeah.
That we enjoy it together and pause over those things that give us a new lens through which to see something we need to cherish.
No, I love that. Well, I love I know we're running out of time a little bit, but the last line of your book, I very much love. But I know you lead into it by quoting a work of, Neil Douglas Klotz's Prayers of the Cosmos, Meditations on the Aramaic words of Jesus. Do you recall the passage I'm referring to? And if so,
I
can
have the
you?
book here.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was hoping that you could. What the reference was really piqued my interest. I was like, "Ooh, that's amazing!" So I was hoping you could kind of speak into that and why you used that to close out your chapter. And of course, you have your own words of closing, but you led into it with his work. Can you just tell us a little bit about what his work is and why that was a good ending?
Yes. So what I see here is cherishing language, I guess, does not prevent us from retranslating from time to time. Instead, it calls us to hold on to what is good, to pay our tithe of due attention to sacred texts as they summon us to lift up our hearts, and to join in the joyful noise of 1,000 tongues that daily pray their versions of Hallowed be thy name, a line that begins in Aramaic with a summoning to hear the one sound that created all others. Well, Neil Douglas Klotz is an Aramaic scholar, and I have so appreciated a little book he wrote. He wrote several, but this little book is called Prayers of the Cosmos. And he talks about how Aramaic and also Hebrew, but this book is about Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, like other Middle Eastern languages, is wide open to mystical experience. It fosters ambiguity in ways that the linearity of English doesn't, for instance. And that translation itself or interpretation itself is a kind of devotional practice in many Middle Eastern cultures. And so what he does in this book is take the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes and goes through them line by line and gives us 7 or 8 different viable translations of each line.
Oh, wow.
And it's just mind-blowing the way it opens up the possibilities of ways to understand, for instance, what it might mean to say, blessed are they that mourn. And the different notions about mourning that can come into play. A word never just means one thing. And his point is that the Middle Eastern languages, specifically Aramaic and Hebrew, never let it just mean one thing. That's why you have the whole tradition of Midrash and so much emphasis in Jewish culture and tradition on rereading the texts and fathoming them in new ways, because meaning is kaleidoscopic. It's not ever just one thing.
That is really cool. Funny how scriptures are written in much Hebrew and Aramaic. Imagine that.
Imagine that. I think that's pretty significant.
I think so too. I love that. Well, I'm actually going to personally look that up. That sounds like a book that I would just love.
Well, I think it's humbling for us who speak a language that has become one of the most powerful language tools in the world, to have to remember that the Bible was not written in English and that we are, it's a living word. And I believe that the Spirit has been at work in all the whole history of translation.
Yeah.
We are reading it in translation. It wasn't written in English. So maybe we need to get over ourselves, we who speak English, somehow tend to think that it's okay to just speak one language because it's such a powerful one.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I was always jealous of
this.
Yeah, I was always jealous of the people who got to study and learn Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. I was like, man, y'all are going to the source.
Well, and I think it's why we need a critical mass of people who do that.
Yeah.
We need. My husband is a retired pastor, and I really leaned on him when he was in the pulpit. If you know the Greek or the Hebrew for a word in the passage, hand it over. We support seminaries. You guys got ordained. You got to study this stuff. We didn't, and I want to know.
I want to know, yeah.
Well, and one of the sermons he preached that I loved was about the moment of Jesus' baptism, when it says in the translation that's usual is, then the heavens opened and a dove descended.
Yeah, I read
and
that
a voice
passage
came and said, "This is my beloved son," and so on. But the word for the heavens opened occurs 2 times in the Gospels.
Okay.
And the word is schizomeno, which means they were ripped open.
Oh, wow.
It's not just that they gently opened and a dove descended, it's they were ripped open.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was the same word that was used for the tearing of the veil of the veil in the temple,
In the
day of
temple,
the
yeah,
crucifixion.
when he died.
And so it's really a message about God breaking into history at that moment.
Oh, so amazing.
Whole different sensibility that you
Yeah.
bring to this story if you get that word.
Oh, it's
And
so
we're not
cool.
going to get it unless somebody just studies the Greek. So
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's beautiful.
we need to keep supporting those somebodies.
Yes. Yes. When we cannot be them, support the ones who are.
Right.
Matthew, did you have any closing questions before we shut down this lovely interview?
No closing questions. I already got the Nimrod the cat question off my chest, so I think I'm all good to go. Take us home, Christina.
All right. Well, I could throw in a wrinkle where I could say, did he live up to his name because I named him, or vice versa, because he did end up being a very mighty hunter. He would bring in multiple kills to my back step every day. So, we could go into the weeds there, but should end the podcast. What do y'all think?
Well, I think we should think very hard before naming our cats.
And our children. Amen. Yes. Thank you, Jesus. All right. Well, it's been lovely to have you today, Marilyn.
Thank you. What a pleasure to meet you both and be in conversation about this. I hope it continues.
Oh, yes. Me too. Absolutely. I will certainly be continuing to think about it. It's just really, really, really important and very beautiful stuff, I think, taken seriously and pondered well. So, but things are winding down. However, I did want to know where we can find your work, Marilyn.
Well, I have a website. It's just marilynmcintyre.com. And most of the books are listed there. And some of the podcasts and articles, or, things are on Amazon, but I don't like to send people to Amazon. So I would say, one wonderful place to get books that I would love to promote whenever I can is Hearts and Minds books.
Oh, I don't know it.
Byron Borger and his wife are the proprietors. It's a Christian bookstore in Pennsylvania. It's been their project for many years to create a Christian bookstore that's an environment where there can be lively, active intellectual exchange. And Byron reviews, I think, pretty much all the books he acquires.
Oh,
they're very responsive if you order through them, and I just think it's a wonderful enterprise to support. So
that's neat. Where in Pennsylvania?
So Hearts and Minds books.
Hearts and Minds books. Okay. I need to look them up. Yeah, I have a lot of history in Pennsylvania, so it'd be kind of cool to go back to my roots and check them out. That's really neat. Well, okay. I know you have a lot of good books. Do you have a favorite or a one on this topic that you feel like all our listeners, or at least Matthew and I, should run out and read?
Well, the Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies has gone into a second edition, and I think it's pertinent. And then I also very much enjoyed writing a book called Word by Word, in which I took a single word and lived with it for a week and wrote a reflection each day about that word. Just living with the word for a week. And I partly did it as a go and do likewise exercise. I think it's a good practice. Yeah. So those two I'm particularly fond of. I did one called When Poets Pray, which was also fun to write.
I noticed that one, actually, and I was, like I said earlier, as someone who loves poetry / tries to dabble in it a bit, that definitely caught my attention. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you both for what you do. It's a great service.
Oh, thank you. We love it. Well, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once Again Believed to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're at it, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.